So in this lesson, we're going to learn how to extend out our ground plane and add a curb to continue catching our shadows. So I've just opened up the file 06end, and so we have our shadows working in our scene. However, we do not have the complete shadow. As you can see here, it's getting cut off. And that's because our ground plane is only extending out so far. So to fix this, we'll need to pull out our ground plane. So let's jump over to our perspective view here. And I'm just going to select the ground plane and right click, go to hull, select this outside hull here, press the W key, and let's just move this out a bit. Now let's jump back to our camera view and take a look at the difference it's made. So now we have our shadow, and let me just pull this back a little bit to frame 1 so we can see more of this animation, or I should say more of the frame where the shadow is falling. Alright, so there's a few problems here. The first being that obviously this shadow is not correct. So we can see here this curb obviously juts up a little bit and then goes out into the sidewalk, but our shadow does not actually respect that. So what we need to do is we need to add in some ground geometry to represent our curb. We also have a little shadow glitch here, as well as a few shadow glitches along the back. Now these ones back here are simply a matter of undersampling. So if you want to fix that, you can jump into your render settings, go to the quality tab, and increase your adaptive sampling to at least 1. So let's increase our max sample level to 1 and -1. Click close, and now if we re-render this portion of our screen, we should see that those gaps are being filled in. So it wasn't actually a problem with our shadow or our geometry, we just weren't rendering enough samples. Now this problem down here still exists. And if we jump back to our perspective view, we can see that is because our ground plane here is actually pulled in on itself. So let's go back to our control vertices here, and let's grab the vertex that is causing this. And we can probably, again, grab our hull here, and let's just grab the last hull. So I'm going to find this on the outside here, and you can see that this point is underneath the rest of our points here. So let's grab that, and let's just pull this out. And now if we jump back to our render view, we should see that small issue fixed. Of course, we'll need to render it through our camera. Okay, so those two problems are taken care of. So now let's add in our curb geometry. So again, I want to find a locator that is approximately where the curb is. So let me just hide my ground plane here, press Control H, and then let's find a locator that's on roughly the same surface as the curb. It looks like this is at the about approximate correct height. So now let's create a new polygon cube, and let's actually snap its pivot point to somewhere along the top. So I'm going to press Insert, hold V, middle click on one of the corners, and hit Insert again. And now, still holding V, let's snap this to one of these two locators. And now that top corner will be at the correct height. Now, of course, this isn't correctly scaled yet, so we'll need to scale it out in the Z-axis. So I'm just going to grab my Z here and scale this out. And we can probably pull it forward, but before we do that, let's actually just assign its material. So again, we want to use assign it the Use Background Shader. So I just jumped into my Hypershade here, and let's jump down to our Use Background, and right-click and assign our material to that. Okay. Now finally we can hit Control-Shift-H to unhide our ground plane, and now we can take a render and take a look at our curb and see what we need to modify. Okay, so here's our render, and the curb is adding a little bit more realism, but as we can see, it's not correctly placed entirely. The shadow should cut out a little bit earlier than it actually is. So inside of our render view here, let's turn on our IPR button, and let's just draw a box over the curb so we can use that in our IPR. Now I'm going to drag this over so we can, again, jump into our perspective view here. And I'm going to press F to frame in on this box. And now we can begin modifying this to better fit our scene. So it looks like the curb is pulling out a little bit here. So we're going to need to rotate this in the Y-axis a little bit out. Okay, that's looking like it's fitting a little better. Now we'll probably need to move it in just a little bit to pull this back to where this highlight begins. Alright, that's looking a lot nicer. And now let's just pull the ground down a little bit. It looks like the ground plane is a little too high. So again, we can select our ground plane, go to our hull, and let's select the outer hull here, and we can just pull this down in the y-axis. So we want to continue pulling this down until our shadow is creasing right where the ground plane meets our curb. So this is looking like a pretty good approximation. It might be a little bit too low here, but it looks like it's almost directly on that curb. So remember that you really want to try to mimic the real world as much as possible. So that just means a lot of observation on the objects inside your footage and then creating these stand-in objects to cast shadows on. So let's go into our camera here and let's scroll through this and let's just check a different frame. Okay, that's looking pretty good. And as you can see, as we scroll through our frames, our IPR updates, but it's just updating our background, so we'll need to re-render this if we actually want to evaluate a different frame. Okay, so even after checking ahead, it looks like this has held up to scrutiny. Okay, great. So let's do a little cleanup now that we've essentially finished the shadows. So we can delete our stand-in object or hide it if you wish. I'm just going to delete my stand-in object so it no longer casts the shadow in our scene. Let's scrub through this and take a look. Okay. Now one issue I am noticing in my render here is that the front of this is off the ground a little bit. Now we might want that, but I really want this to be touching the ground at this point. So you can see here there's a distance between our shadow and our object. So we'll need to pull this down a little bit. So let's just grab our sign group here. So I'm going to jump into my outliner, grab my sign group, and let's just rotate this a little bit. I'm going to rotate it in the Z-axis just a bit until it begins to penetrate that ground. And I'm just going to pull it down a little bit in the y-axis. So as I said before, as we begin adding more and more features such as shadowing and direct lighting into our scene, we're probably going to need to come in here and tweak the placement of our object as we gain more and more cues about the placement of this in the real scene. So let's just jump back to frame 1 in our camera and take a re-render of our modified location. Okay, this is looking much nicer. As we can see, the geometry is on the ground, the shadow is touching, and it looks a lot nicer. So now that we have all our shadow geometry created, we can begin breaking this scene into various render layers and render passes so that we can gain the most control inside of our compositing application.